Welcome. I'm Bruce Munro. With me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern continues to set the global agenda following the Christchurch mosque shootings. Now she has announced that New Zealand and France will join forces to tackle terrorism and violence on social media. Welcome, Robert.
Morning, Bruce.
This is certainly a step onto the middle of the world stage for Ardern. What went on behind the scenes that led to this joint initiative?
I think this initiative actually comes, I think there's long-term causes and short-term causes. I think the long-term causes is that since Jacinda Ardern's been Prime Minister, she's been having extensive discussions with other foreign leaders. And there's been deep concern, both in Europe and in the United States, about the rise of the right, and particularly the extreme language they're using, as well as, of course, the extreme language being used by pro-Islamist groups. And I think that's the long-term concern. I think the short-term, of course, the terrible atrocity at Christchurch, and the fact that the chief perpetrator used GoPro technology on his head and had the event live streamed. And of course, the government's been scrambling since the Christchurch atrocity on the 15th of March to try to get major high-tech companies like Facebook to move against the recording of that appalling event. I think these combination of long-term and short-term factors have brought it into sharp focus that something must be done. And I think from the government's point of view, they believe it's an obligation to the victims and their families to try to prevent a situation where these sort of ideas of hatred can be circulating and can lead to such atrocities that we saw in Christchurch, for example.
So there is a plan for a meeting in May. What is the plan?
Well, France is chairing the G7 meeting, which is one of the reasons I think why New Zealand has partnered with France. President Macron is chairing a meeting of the G7 digital ministers, as they're called. And so this was an ideal opportunity to key in to something that's already in the works and table this initiative. And I think that France and New Zealand working together through the G7. The other thing here is that many of the large high-tech companies like Facebook have been relatively indifferent to the individual appeals by countries. 9 European countries have appealed to Facebook to rein in some of this hate language, and they've been unresponsive, but they will take note of the G7 group, which includes some of the most prominent countries in the world.
Is there enough support for an international agreement, do you think?
I think the government wouldn't be undertaking this unless they were reasonably confident that there was at least encouraging signs from other partners. And I think that in Europe, and perhaps to a lesser extent in the United States, but certainly in Europe, there are real concerns about the rise of hate language on the internet and also the resulting upgrowth of national populism. So I think, yes, particularly from the European point of view, I think that there is an anticipation there will be quite a lot of substantial support. And I think countries like Japan as well will be quite supportive on this issue.
Could some sort of agreement actually effectively make any change, make a difference?
I think it could. To use a domestic analogy, Bruce, many countries which are liberal democracies like New Zealand have domestic laws which put limits on freedom of speech. You or I are not, we're free to go about our business in a lawful way. But if we started advocating violence against our neighbour on spurious grounds, we would quickly face the full rigour of the law. I think what Jacinda Ardern is seeking is not to curb freedom of expression, but to actually put some limits on the sort of Wild West bandit country which the internet is in the moment. You're allowed to get away with things on the internet that you wouldn't get away with if you publicly spoke within a society like New Zealand. And I think there's an attempt to extend domestic sort of regulation you find in many liberal democracies into the international arena.
Could such an agreement actually have some dangers with it, though, that we need to be aware of?
I think there are some. I mean, let's be quite clear. Several countries like China already regulate the internet, and other authoritarian states. I don't think that is the intention behind. There is a danger, but I think the government's mindful of the danger. And my sense is what we're seeking to do is strike a balance between power and responsibility. We want people to have the individual power to freely use the internet, unlike, say, China. But we want them to have some responsibility in doing so. And that is one of the disturbing things for me, is the number of senior politicians in North America and elsewhere who've been using terms like enemy. They've been castigating. I mean, President Trump, for example, spoke about the media as the enemy of the people. That language may seem innocuous to many people, but seen through someone who has hired ideological views or white supremacist views, it could be a motivator. Language like traitor, appeasement, surrender, all these terms can be quite explosive. So in a sense, I do think there is a need for regulation. It's also important, I think, to send a message to groups which want to use this language, is that they cannot painlessly and quite cowardly use it in a medium where they can't be brought to account.
Do we need an internationally agreed set of values, or how do we make this work?
I think it will be difficult to achieve an internationally set of values. I mean, at the moment we're seeing quite a clash of ideas about how the world should be organised. Russia has quite different views from much of Western Europe, and China also has very different views from both Russia and Western Europe. And the United States, again, under the Trump administration, seems to have a different worldview from many other liberal democracies. But I think what often happens is that countries can agree on what I call a minimal set of values. Most countries agree that citizens should be free from torture, for example. They may not agree to an absolutely watertight definition of human rights, but they can agree on minimal standards. And I think what we're looking for here is an agreement on minimal standards for freedom of expression on the internet. And we're not seeking. I don't think the intention is to rein in people's ability to express themselves, but to make sure that when they do, they're not using a language of hatred and violence in an unsubstantiated way that is not factually based.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. A bientôt.